Hey guys, welcome to my new movie review. Today I'm going to be reviewing the film The Hateful Eight. This is the new Quentin Tarantino film. Apparently, it's his eighth film. I guess if it's the title pretty well. In this film, you guys, it's a film about a group of people who live out in the West. I think it's in Wyoming somewhere, and I think even possibly during the Revolutionary War at some point. But it's during a severe blizzard, and all these people are trying to find shelter. They end up using the same buggy together. They use this little guy who's riding a horse along, and they find this cabin eventually. And so they get there, and then they find out, obviously, with the title being The Hateful Eight, there's about eight people in this cabin. And then all of them are being honest with each other. Some people are saying they're this completely different thing than what they really are. And so as the film progresses, we find out who's really telling the truth, who's lying the whole time, who's trying to be somebody that they're not. And so things get more severe as people stay in this cabin longer and longer as this blizzard progresses throughout the movie. So overall, guys, I thought The Hateful Eight was okay. I know it's getting possibly even some Oscar buzz right now. A lot of people really seem to enjoy this movie. I, for one hand, thought it was just okay. I didn't think it was quite the achievement that Django Unchained was, or other Quentin Tarantino projects like Pulp Fiction or Kill Bill. I think this film isn't quite as good as those ones. But I think, obviously, when I go over my positives here in a minute, there's certain things about it that I think is really good. It clearly is a Quentin Tarantino film because there's a lot of really good things about it, but it's just not quite as good a film as some other things he's worked on in the past. So, for my positives and negatives of The Hateful Eight, I thought this film was consistently mysterious. I liked how you really didn't know who was what until it's really the third act of the movie. The film really was mysterious. There's people who you really think are doing these really terrible things, and as the film progresses, it's somebody completely different than who you think it might be. So it consistently was mysterious, and it's good in that sense. I also thought this is a well acted film. It has a huge all star cast. We have Kurt Russell, Samuel L. Jackson, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Bruce Dern, Michael Madsen. There's a ton of people in this movie. Even Channing Tatum makes an appearance at one point. It's a well acted film. They definitely got the right cast to pull off this material. So, acting wise, I was pretty impressed. This film also uses the typical Tarantino traditions, which for me is a good thing because I always like to see how Quentin Tarantino adds his own little touch to his movies. The Red Apple cigarettes are back. Well, in this case, it's Red Apple tobacco since cigarettes are kind of a later thing. The typical, dialogue that's really tense that kind of moves the story along. Really interesting stuff that these characters talk about. Once again, Tarantino is definitely in the set of this movie because his dialogue is very strong with these characters. I also like how this film feels like a 60s Western, specifically in the beginning, like first 15 minutes of the movie, the opening credits, the Panavision, like telling you what camera they used, even the old typeface on the logo of the Hateful Eight at the beginning. It all feels like something out of the 60s. I was kind of waiting for like Steve McQueen or Jimmy Stewart to pop up at some point. It really does feel like an older film, and I think that's one thing that's really cool that Tarantino continues to do with his movies. I also like that this film enforces the rules of what people can and can't do in the cabin, what certain characters are allowed to do, because there's certain characters who can overpower other characters throughout the movie, and Tarantino reminds us of those rules and how those rules can impact that character later in the movie when things get more severe at this cabin. And I like the little character nuances. There's certain things that these characters do throughout the movie that definitely remind you that you are looking at Jennifer Jason Leigh and not Samuel L. Jackson, and so on and so forth. These characters are very specific for what they are and what they do and what they feel it represents themselves. So I like all the little character nuances that Tarantino enforced upon the characters. For my negatives of The Hateful Eight, why I don't think it's Tarantino's best film, is I thought the bloodbath portion, specifically in the third act when the film really gets violent, it felt kind of pointless. It just felt like blood for the sake of blood. I think Tarantino is better than that. I think he has a purpose behind what he does in his movies. And in The Hateful Eight, this is probably the first time it's happened in a movie where the violence seems to be there just to be there. And I don't think, because the film was so tense with its mystery and its dialogue, when the violence came about finally, it felt different in a way that wasn't good for a movie like this. I also thought this movie was 45 minutes too long. I thought it could have made its point much faster than it did. It really drags at certain times. I think a good 45 minutes of this film could have been cut and it still would have been a great movie and a better movie. The film, like I said, mentioned a second ago, and I'm going to mention it again, it's a very dragged out and slow story. The pacing here is pretty slow. I understand Tarantino was probably trying to make that third act feel really tense by the time the things started to pick up in this cabin, but it does feel very dragged out. It's a very long experience, and I don't know in this case if long is a good way to experience this movie. So for me, it was a little slow. I also thought that the film that takes place, I would say 70% of the movie is probably indoors, just because it is in a cabin for a good chunk of the movie's in a cabin for a good chunk of the movie. That's what I meant to say. And Tarantino has used a 70 millimeter camera for the movie. He's shot this movie in 70 millimeter. And for me, when you're going to shoot indoors for that long, that's kind of a waste. I know he's trying to make the shots feel more intimate, but to me, if you're going to shoot 70 millimeters, stick with those cool outdoor shots at the beginning and that he had throughout the movie. But we just don't have a good use enough for those 70 millimeter. I almost wish that Django Unchained could have been done in 70 millimeter, and this could have been done like a traditional movie. Because for me, I thought this film specifically, I didn't completely understand why it had to be 70 millimeter. And then I also thought that this film probably would have been better off as a play. I like if Tarantino eventually retires from filmmaking and does plays and books like he's been talking about. I think The Hateful Eight would have probably been a better play than a movie, just because it does take place in one setting for a really long time. Thus, a play would be a more fitting format for a story like this, I thought. So, obviously there's flashbacks and things that make it more movie-like, but I thought this story in particular, Tarantino probably could have saved this for a play or something that he did after he was done making films. I also thought, like I said, once again, this is not Tarantino's best. I really think Pulp Fiction's a better story, has better characters, has a better purpose for what's going on. Same with Kill Bill. I thought both of those films were better than this one. And I even thought Django Unchained was better than this movie. So 7.5 out of 10 for me. The Hateful Eight is an okay film. I think there's things about it that are really admirable and does continue the Tarantino traditions that he's always well known for. But they really felt like a pointless bloodbath after a while. It felt too long, really slow, really dragged out. Some shots feel like a waste of 70 millimeter. It really is not Tarantino's best. And I think this story would have been better off as a play or a book, because as a movie, I don't think it's as fun as if it could have been a play or a book instead. So 7.5 out of 10 for me. It's an okay film. If you like Tarantino, I would just say rent this one. Like I said, the 70 millimeter I thought was kind of ruined for this movie. I thought it could have been used for a different film that he could have worked on with more outdoor shots. So it's an okay film. If you like Tarantino, you could probably rent it from Redbox eventually. I think there's better films at the theater right now, to be honest. Just go see Star Wars again or something. So 7.5 out of 10 for me. It's an okay film.